A billionaire tech CEO, surrounded by his wealthy friends at an exclusive dinner party, spots his quiet black housekeeper polishing silverware in the corner. With a smirk, he calls out, "Hey Camille, you look smart enough. Want to play chess with me?" The room erupts in laughter. They think it's just another joke at her expense. But when Camille sits down at that marble chessboard, her opening move silences every single person in that room. The move that followed? Something you'd only expect from a grandmaster. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany dining table, as Richard Blackstone adjusted his $3,000 suit jacket. The 45-year-old CEO of Nexus Technologies had built his empire on reading people, exploiting weaknesses, and always staying 3 steps ahead. Tonight's dinner party was no different. 12 of Silicon Valley's most powerful executives gathered in his Palo Alto mansion, each one a potential ally or rival in his next billion-dollar venture. "Gentlemen," Richard raised his wineglass, "to another year of leaving the competition in the dust." The room filled with the sound of expensive crystal clinking together. Richard's eyes swept across his guests, venture capitalists, tech moguls, and old money elites who controlled more wealth than most small countries. This wasn't just dinner, it was a chess match of power and influence. In the corner, Camille Bennett moved quietly between the serving stations, her movements precise and efficient. She'd worked for the Blackstone family for 3 years, cleaning, organizing, and maintaining the household with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything in her life. At 32, she was invisible to most of the guests, just another piece of expensive furniture in Richard's perfectly curated world. "Richard, I heard you picked up that vintage chess set at the auction last month," called out Marcus Webb, a ruthless hedge fund manager. 18th century marble, wasn't it? Richard's face lit up with pride. "Imported from Italy. Cost me more than most people's houses." He gestured toward the ornate chess set displayed on a side table. "I've been undefeated for 6 months straight. These tech bros think they're smart, but they can't think more than 2 moves ahead." The conversation flowed around topics of market manipulation, hostile takeovers, and crushing smaller competitors. Camille continued her work, her keen ears picking up every word, while her hands polished the same wineglass for the 3rd time. She'd learned long ago that powerful men revealed their secrets when they forgot the help was listening. "Speaking of chess," Richard's voice suddenly cut through the chatter. "I wonder if we're being too elitist here." His tone carried a mock sincerity that made several guests lean forward with interest. "Maybe we should give everyone a chance to play." Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow at the same time, we'll bring you another story of Black people leading the way that you won't want to miss. His gaze fixed on Camille, and a cruel smile spread across his face. "What do you say, Camille? You look intelligent enough. Want to try your hand at chess?" The room fell silent, except for the soft clink of Camille, setting down her polishing cloth. Every eye turned toward her, some filled with curiosity, others with barely concealed amusement. Richard's question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down at a medieval court. "Mr. Blackstone," Camille's voice was steady, professional. "I wouldn't want to interrupt your evening with your guests." "Nonsense." Richard stood up, his movements theatrical. "This is exactly what this evening needs. A little entertainment. Besides, I'm curious to see how the other half thinks." Marcus Webb chuckled, pulling out his phone. "This should be good." "Richard, you know she's never played before, right? That's what makes it interesting." Richard replied, already moving toward the chess set. "I'll even spot her a few pieces. Make it fair." The other executives began placing informal bets, their voices low but eager. Thomas Chen, a venture capitalist, leaned back in his chair with a knowing smile. "I give her 3 moves before she's completely lost." "3 moves?" laughed David Morrison, a real estate mogul. "That's generous. I say 2. Camille remained perfectly still, her dark eyes moving from face to face, reading each expression like pages in a book. She'd seen this before. Powerful men who confused cruelty with entertainment, who built their confidence by tearing others down. What they didn't know was that she'd been studying them for 3 years, learning their patterns, understanding their weaknesses. "Well?" Richard's voice carried across the room. Are you going to accept my generous offer? Or are you too scared? The provocation was clear. He wanted her to refuse, to give him and his friends a story about the timid housekeeper who knew her place. But Camille had been underestimated her entire life, and she'd learned to turn it into an advantage. I accept, she said simply, walking toward the chess set with the same calm dignity she brought to everything else. The guests erupted in surprised murmurs. Richard's eyebrows shot up. He'd expected her to decline gracefully. Now he was committed to a game he'd intended as a joke. Excellent, he clapped his hands together. Set up the board, and let's see what you've got. As Camille approached the marble chess set, her fingers traced the edge of the board. The pieces were cold and smooth, each one perfectly carved. She'd played on boards made of cardboard and plastic, but never on something this expensive. The irony wasn't lost on her. Do you know how the pieces move? Richard asked condescendingly, settling into his chair. I believe I can figure it out, Camille replied, taking her seat across from him. What happened next would change everything in that room, and neither Richard nor his guests were prepared for what Camille Bennett was about to unleash. Richard cracked his knuckles dramatically, playing to his audience. Since I'm feeling generous tonight, I'll even let you play white. First move advantage and all that. The executives gathered around the table, drinks in hand, phones ready to record what they assumed would be a quick and amusing demolition. The betting had escalated. Someone mentioned $1,000 side wager on whether she'd last 10 moves. Camille studied the board for exactly 15 seconds. Her hand moved to her king's pawn, then hesitated. The room held its breath, anticipating her amateur fumbling. Instead, she picked up her queen's knight and placed it on. The move was unusual, sophisticated, and completely unexpected. Richard's confident smile faltered for just a moment. The Alekhine defense? An aggressive, counter-attacking opening that most beginners had never heard of, let alone played. He glanced around the room, noting the sudden quiet among his guests. Interesting choice, he said, trying to maintain his composure. Most people start with the center pawns. Most people, Camille replied evenly, aren't trying to win. The words sent a chill through the room. This wasn't the timid housekeeper they'd expected. Richard moved his king's pawn 2 squares forward, a classical response, but his mind was now racing. The Alekhine defense was a tricky opening, one that lured white into overextending before launching a devastating counterattack. Camille's next move came faster. Knight to d5, directly attacking his pawn and forcing an immediate decision. Richard's jaw tightened. She wasn't just playing chess, she was playing it well. You've played before, he said, no longer bothering to hide his surprise. A little, Camille answered, her eyes never leaving the board. Marcus Webb leaned over Richard's shoulder. She's using the Alekhine defense. That's not beginner stuff. I can see that, Richard snapped, his friendly facade cracking. He pushed his attacked pawn forward, but Camille was ready. Her knight retreated to b6, and suddenly Richard realized he'd walked into a trap. His pawn was overextended, his king's position weakened. The room's atmosphere shifted. The laughter died away, replaced by tense silence. These men had gathered to watch a cruel joke, but they were witnessing something else entirely. A chess master at work. Thomas Chen put away his phone. This isn't going the way we expected. David Morrison's expression grew serious. Richard, you said she was just a housekeeper. She is, Richard insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. On the board, Camille had developed her pieces with surgical precision. Her bishops controlled long diagonals, her knights occupied strong central squares, and her king was safely castled. Meanwhile, Richard's position was crumbling. His early aggression had backfired, leaving his pieces poorly coordinated and his king dangerously exposed. He was no longer playing for entertainment, he was playing for survival. Your move? Camille said softly. And for the first time all evening, Richard Blackstone looked genuinely worried. Sweat beaded on Richard's forehead as he stared at the board. What had started as a condescending joke had become a nightmare. His pieces were scattered, his king vulnerable, and worst of all, his reputation was on the line in front of the most powerful people in Silicon Valley. Take your time, Camille said gently. But her words felt like daggers. Richard's hand hovered over his bishop, then his knight, then back to his bishop. Every move seemed to lead to disaster. The executives behind him had gone completely silent, their earlier amusement replaced by uncomfortable tension. "This is impossible," Marcus Webb whispered. "She's a housekeeper. Where did she learn to play like this?" Thomas Chen was frantically Googling on his phone. That opening sequence, it's textbook Elakine defense, but she's playing it like a grandmaster. Richard finally moved his bishop. A desperate attempt to create some threats. Camille's response was immediate and devastating. Her queen slid across the board to b6, attacking his bishop and simultaneously threatening his king. The position was like a perfectly constructed trap, and Richard had walked right into it. "Check," Camille announced quietly. The word hit the room like a thunderclap. Richard's face went pale as he realized his king had nowhere to go. Every escape square was controlled by Camille's pieces. In chess, this was called a discovered attack, a tactical masterpiece that only experienced players could execute. "This isn't possible," Richard muttered, his hands shaking as he moved his king to the only available square. "Actually," Camille said, her voice still calm and respectful, "it's quite possible when you understand the patterns." She moved her rook to d8, and suddenly Richard saw the full scope of his doom. His king was trapped, his pieces were hanging, and his position was completely hopeless. In 3 more moves, it would be checkmate. The silence in the room was deafening. These men had built their fortunes on being smarter than everyone else, on exploiting weaknesses and maintaining control. But now they were watching one of their own being systematically dismantled by someone they dismissed as invisible. David Morrison cleared his throat. "Richard, maybe you should—" "No," Richard cut him off sharply. "I'm not giving up." But even as he spoke, he knew it was over. Camille had outplayed him so thoroughly that continuing would only make his humiliation worse. Still, his pride wouldn't let him surrender. He made another desperate move, hoping against hope for a miracle. Camille's response was swift and final. Her queen captured his rook, and the sound of marble hitting marble echoed through the silent room. "Checkmate," she said simply. The words hung in the air like a judgment. Richard stared at the board, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He'd been defeated, not just defeated, but destroyed, by the woman he'd intended to mock. But the game was only the beginning of what Camille Bennett had planned for this evening. The silence stretched on, until it became unbearable. Richard sat frozen, staring at the board where his king lay toppled, surrounded by Camille's pieces like a conquered city. The sound of his own heartbeat thundered in his ears. "That was—" Thomas Chen started, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Extraordinary," Marcus Webb completed, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard finally looked up at Camille, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and something that might have been fear. "Who are you?" Camille folded her hands in her lap, her expression unchanged. "I'm exactly who you think I am, Mr. Blackstone. I clean your house, organize your files, and maintain your household. I also happen to know how to play chess." "That wasn't just knowing how to play," David Morrison interjected. "That was professional-level chess. Where did you learn to play like that?" For the first time since sitting down, Camille allowed herself a small smile. "My grandfather taught me when I was 7. He said chess was the great equalizer, that on the board everyone starts with the same pieces, and the only thing that matters is how you use your mind." Richard's face flushed red. "You made me look like a fool." "No, sir," Camille replied respectfully. "You did that yourself when you assumed that cleaning your house means I don't have a brain." The comment hit like a physical blow. Richard had built his entire identity around being the smartest person in the room, and now he'd been exposed as arrogant and small-minded in front of his most important business associates. "There's more to this," Thomas Chen said slowly. "I've seen that style of play before. The way you controlled the center, the timing of your attacks. That's not just good chess. That's championship-level chess." Camille's smile grew slightly wider. "I was ranked number 3 in the country for women under 18. I had a full scholarship to Stanford for chess." The room exploded in shocked murmurs. Stanford, the same university where several of these men had gotten their start, where they'd learned to see themselves as the intellectual elite. "You went to Stanford?" Marcus Webb asked in disbelief. I was accepted, Camille corrected. I couldn't afford to go, even with the scholarship. Books, housing, living expenses, it was impossible for someone like me. Richard's world was crumbling around him. Not only had he been outplayed by his housekeeper, but she was more qualified than he'd ever suspected. Why didn't you say anything? Why work as a housekeeper if you're so smart? Because, Camille said, standing up from the chess table. Sometimes the best way to understand powerful people is to become invisible to them. And Mr. Blackstone, you've taught me more about your business in 3 years than you could ever imagine. The threat in her words was subtle but unmistakable. Richard's face went white as he realized what she was implying. What do you mean by that? He asked, his voice barely audible. Camille straightened her uniform and picked up her cleaning cloth. I mean that when you're cleaning someone's office, organizing their files, and listening to their phone calls, you learn things. Important things. The room fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. The kind that comes when everyone realizes the game has changed completely. The atmosphere in the room transformed from embarrassment to genuine alarm. Richard's guests exchanged worried glances, each man suddenly remembering the sensitive conversations they'd had in his presence over the past 3 years. Now wait just a minute, Richard said, his voice rising with panic. Whatever you think you heard, I didn't think I heard anything, Camille interrupted calmly. I know exactly what I heard. Every phone call, every private meeting, every conversation you thought was safe, because the help was invisible. Marcus Webb's face went ashen. The Henderson deal, he whispered. The insider trading on the quantum acquisition. Thomas Chen added, his voice hollow. The tax evasion scheme with the offshore accounts. David Morrison said, sinking into his chair. Richard looked around the room desperately. She's bluffing. She's just trying to. Yesterday at 3:47 p.m., Camille said, her voice cutting through his protests like a blade. You told Marcus that the Henderson deal was based on information from your contact at the SEC. You said, and I quote, the beauty of it is they'll never trace it back to us. Marcus Webb's wine glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. That's impossible. We were alone in the study. You were, Camille agreed, but I was polishing the bookshelf on the other side of the wall. The one with the loose panel that you never noticed. The room erupted in panicked whispers. These men had built their fortunes on information, on knowing things others didn't. Now they were discovering that someone had been collecting information on them for 3 years. What do you want? Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. That depends, Camille replied, moving to the window and looking out at the city lights below. I've been offered a position at the SEC's Financial Crimes Division. They're very interested in the information I've gathered. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard felt his world collapsing around him. Everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for, was about to be destroyed by the woman he treated as invisible. Or, Camille continued, turning back to face the room, I could choose to forget what I've heard. Memory can be such a fragile thing. How much? Marcus Webb asked desperately. Camille shook her head. I don't want your money. I want something else. What? Richard demanded. I want you to remember this night, Camille said, her voice steady and strong. I want you to remember that the person you dismissed as worthless just took everything you thought you knew about yourself and turned it inside out. I want you to remember that intelligence doesn't have a uniform, and respect isn't something you can buy. She walked back to the chess table and picked up the white king that had delivered checkmate. I want you to remember that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one you never bothered to see. The men sat in stunned silence, their faces pale and their hands trembling. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and they all knew it. Now, Camille said, placing the king back on the board, I have work to finish. As Camille moved toward the door, Richard found his voice. Wait. She turned back, her expression neutral but her eyes alert. The SEC position, he said carefully. Is it real? Very real, Camille replied. They've been investigating financial crimes in Silicon Valley for months. They were looking for someone on the inside. Someone who could provide information about the major players. The blood drained from Richard's face. You're working with them. I wasn't, Camille said. But after tonight, after watching you try to humiliate me for your friend's entertainment, I'm seriously considering it. Thomas Chen leaned forward desperately. There has to be something we can do. Some arrangement we can make. Camille considered this for a long moment. Actually, there is something. The room held its breath. I want you to establish a scholarship fund, she said. Full ride to Stanford, specifically for young black women who want to study chess and mathematics. $20 million, managed by an independent board. 20 million? Marcus Webb sputtered. Between all of you, that's pocket change, Camille replied. And I want it named after my grandfather, William Bennett. He died believing that intelligence was the great equalizer, but never got to see what I accomplished tonight. Richard's mind raced. $20 million was significant, but not nearly as costly as what the SEC investigation would bring. And if we do this, then I'll remember you as the man who chose to do the right thing, instead of the man who tried to make a fool of his housekeeper. The executives looked at each other, all of them doing the same calculation. The scholarship was expensive, but prison was far more costly. Done, Richard said quickly. We'll have the lawyers draw up the papers tomorrow. Camille nodded. And I'll need to verify the funding within a week. If it's not there, I'll know exactly where to take my information. She moved toward the door again, then paused. Oh, and gentlemen, you might want to be more careful about your conversations in the future. You never know who might be listening. As she reached the doorway, Richard called out one final time. Camille. She looked back. How long have you been planning this? Her smile was enigmatic. From the moment I realized you saw me as invisible? See, the thing about being underestimated is that it gives you time to plan. And I've been planning for 3 years. The chess game was just the opening move, she finished. Good night, Mr. Blackstone. As the door closed behind her, the room remained silent. 7 of the most powerful men in Silicon Valley sat in stunned defeat, checkmated by a woman they'd never bothered to see. Richard looked down at the marble chess set, where the White King still lay conquered. He'd learned something tonight that no amount of money could buy. That true power isn't about controlling others. It's about understanding the game well enough to win it, even when everyone thinks you don't know how to play. And Camille Bennett had just played the game of her life. 3 months later, the William Bennett Scholarship Fund was established with full funding and an independent board. The first recipient was a 16-year-old chess prodigy from Detroit who dreamed of studying mathematics at Stanford. Camille Bennett never did take the position with the SEC. Instead, she used her reputation and the connections she'd made to start her own consulting firm, helping other underestimated individuals navigate the corridors of power. And Richard Blackstone, he never played chess again. But he did learn to notice the people he'd spent years ignoring, starting with learning the names of every person who worked in his building. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. And sometimes the person you think you're defeating is actually 10 moves ahead of you, waiting for the perfect moment to say checkmate.